Okay, welcome everybody to August's webinar from the Quantitative Ethnography Society. I'm Simon Buckingham-Shum, coming to you at the start of the day in Sydney, and co-hosting is Brendan Egan in the US. So we're really delighted to welcome you to this webinar. We have got Golnaz Arastoopour Irgens with us today. We're delighted to have Gol with us, who was one of the keynote speakers at the inaugural conference. And we've asked her to come back and give us an update on her thinking. She's going to be sharing some examples of her most recent work as well. Gol's a former teacher, a former school teacher in computer science and high school maths. And then she went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to do her master's in learning sciences, and then a PhD working with the epistemic games group there with David and Brendan and others. So it's great to see her with us today. And now she's at Clemson University, where she is the director of the IDEA Lab, which is the Inclusive Digital Education and Analytics Lab. So Gol, if you can put your slides up, that would be great. We're delighted to have you with us here, and we'll hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and get my slides up. Just take a minute. Okay. All right. Does that look good and everybody can hear me? I'll just look for a thumbs up. All right, great. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for having me for this webinar series. Thank you to Simon and Brendan for organizing this, and I'm sure many people behind the scenes who are also helping organize this. I think this was a great step towards building this community. And thank you for you all for attending the webinars and attending this webinar to hear me talk. Today I'm talking about using quantitative ethnography to tell stories that have not been told before. Before I dive into that, Simon gave me a very nice introduction, but I wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who I have not had the chance to meet yet. So this is me about in 2010, about 10 years ago now. As Simon mentioned, I started working with David in Madison. You might recognize this if you saw my keynote. I showed this photo. But back then it was known as the Epistemic Games Group, not Epistemic Analytics. And I came at a really great time, I think, in the group's research trajectory where, you know, David had been thinking about ENA for a long time, I'm sure, but right when I entered is when we really started to develop, you know, full speed these tools, including ENA. So when I started, ENA was in an Excel spreadsheet. And now, as you know, we have lots of options for using ENA, and it's branched into this whole new field. So it's a very exciting time for me. And I was heavily involved in the development of ENA, the tools, and starting to create that community, which Brendan has taken over and has done a wonderful job. So 7 years later, I graduated, I made it with my PhD in the learning sciences. And then as Simon mentioned, almost immediately after that, I received a postdoc position at Northwestern University, which is near Chicago in the US, in the School of Education and Social Policy. I was there for 2 years working on a project called CT STEM, Computational Thinking in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math. And I mean, they brought me on because of what I was doing with ENA and QE. And my work there was largely around measuring and modeling computational thinking. And so started to build a QE community there, still collaborating with people in the CT STEM project, working on ENA and QE and measuring computational thinking. Then, as Simon mentioned, I got a faculty position as assistant professor, a tenure track position at Clemson in 2019 in the College of Education. And here's where I've been able to develop my own research lab called the IDEA Lab, Inclusive Digital Education and Analytics. The design or digital education part is designing learning environments for young people to explore digital ideas, computer science ideas, engineering, math, either using digital or non-digital tools. And of course, the analytics part is developing inclusive analytics measures rooted in QE to make sense of student learning. So I've been very fortunate to do that. I've been in Clemson, which is in South Carolina in the US for the last year. I live here with my husband and my 3-year-old son. And we have a baby girl on the way. So we're expecting her in about a month and a half. And she has been kicking me as I'm talking. So I think she's either really excited about this talk or is telling me to be quiet so she can get some sleep. Either way, we won't know, but hope it's the first. Okay, so that's a little bit about me, but what I wanted to talk about today are some important affordances of quantitative ethnography. So similar to my keynote at the last conference, I'm going to touch on some of those ideas if you had a chance to see that talk. And I'll describe some of those affordances through an example of a study that we're working on right now in my lab. Before I do that, I want to talk about what I think is at the heart of the QE approach that makes it different from other methodologies. And I think it's the cycle of analytic iterations between observational data and the interpretation, where we're using ethnographic concepts such as theoretical saturation and thick descriptions, but we're also using statistical approaches, which include thinking about reliability, validity, and statistical significance. So this is truly a unified qualitative and quantitative analysis when we do QE, in which we're answering one research question. It makes it different from mixed methods. And another thing that makes this process unique is the back and forth that typically occurs between human interpretation and computer interpretation and negotiating those meanings. So as you've heard before in QE language, talking about closing that interpretive loop, I just want to point out that sometimes we talk about it as if closing that interpretive loop and that's the end, or maybe it happens one time. And usually that's what we see in published work. You close the interpretive loop once and that's it. But actually this process is very iterative, and I think that process isn't really discussed very often. So here I want to discuss a little bit about iteration in QE and some of the other detailed processes in QE that support 3 claims that I'm going to make around the power of QE. 3 claims in 30 minutes, we'll see. So the first thing I want to talk about is that I think QE helps us directly confront biases and assumptions in ourselves and in our tools. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how QE lets us tell cohesive stories at multiple levels. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how in QE researchers can co-create understandings with participants and collaborators. So I'm going to highlight these 3 claims through an example, a study that we're conducting in my lab. I have 2 wonderful students right now in my lab who are both here, I think. One is Cinnamon Bailey, and the second is Hazel Vega Quesada. So I'm going to talk about a study that's being led by Hazel right now. So a little bit about her. She's a doctoral student in the Learning Sciences program at Clemson, and she's a member of the IDEA Lab. She studies pre-service teachers' identity development and their language learning histories. And that's what the study we'll be talking about today. And this is important to know about her. She taught English as a foreign language for 15 years in Costa Rica. And the reason I think that's important to know is because of the ethnographic nature of the work that she's doing. She is interviewing pre-service teachers, so teachers in training, at this institution that she has been affiliated with for a really long time. And so she has that insider status, which can be really important when it comes to ethnographic work, both in terms of data collection and interpretation. So as I mentioned, the study is about pre-service teachers who are teaching English or learning to teach English as a foreign language, sometimes referred to as EFL teachers, in this higher education institution in Costa Rica. So this particular study is with 4 pre-service teachers, and we're just looking at interview data for this preliminary study. So we're examining teachers' identity development and trying to understand the formation of their professional identities. And to do this, we've drawn this phenomenon that's been recognized in this field of research about a hierarchical dichotomy between a native and a non-native speaker. So to be clear, the native speaker is a native speaker of English, and a non-native speaker doesn't have English as their first language. So in this particular study, these teachers, their native language is Spanish, and they're non-native speakers of English. So what this dichotomy in the literature shows is that the native English speaker becomes this idealized figure for culture and language, And then what that does is characterizes the non-native speaker as inferior, flawed, and sometimes as a non-white other. So in many programs, this gets adopted and the native speaker becomes a benchmark for teacher evaluation. And this gets manifested in many ways. So one way is, not having an accent when you speak English versus having an accent, or being completely error-free when you write or speak English versus having some errors in the grammar. And so there's this view of whether you do it right or you do it wrong. And as part of the ethnographic investigation in the study was to collect data from the teacher preparation program in the form of course syllabi, assessment rubrics, descriptions of the program that talked about the program's theoretical grounding, the practices and ideologies that were valued and taught in the program. And what Hazel discovered was student work is often expected to be free from grammatical mistakes and include correct sentences. Students are expected to monitor the consonant and vowel sounds and make correct use of intonation. And one other thing, English-only policies, there were strict English-only policies that did not allow students to use Spanish, and translation in Spanish-like structures were not well received. So what she discovered is that there was a strong emphasis on correctness and non-accented English speaking from an English native speaker point of view. This is problematic from what we know about identity development research, which is actually a very dynamic process that involves a negotiation of multiple identities. And this depends on the individual and the context that they're in. When we're in different contexts, we bring in our multiple identities when we interact with people. And the development of our identities as professionals can be fluid and actually full of tensions. So this is reflected from a communities of practice lens that we're using. A teacher education program can be viewed as a community where all members share ways of thinking and doing and developing, and being a member of that community is developing a sense of identification with them. And what the communities of practice framework claims is that there's an ongoing negotiation that happens as new members enter the practice. So at times, people's identities of the community might conflict with their own identities and they reject ideologies and practices, or sometimes they adopt the ideologies and practices that are meaningful to them within the community. So there's this duality that exists, but it's not a dichotomy. It's a dynamic spectrum that has this middle area of tensions between the two. This tension as pre-service teachers integrate their personal expectations and those expectations of the community. So this zone of tension, as we're calling it, has been underexplored, especially in the area with EFL teachers. So there's still a need to characterize these tensions, analyze how they go noticed or unnoticed with pre-service teachers, and how they're addressed or unaddressed in their teacher education programs. So the exploratory research question we have now is, how do EFL pre-service teachers make sense of dominant native and non-native speaker discourses and perceive legitimate practices from the community when negotiating their emerging teacher identities? So this is ongoing work. We have one publication right now, one under review, and one in progress. So I'll share a little bit from bits and pieces of all of that. So first I'll talk about the codes. All the data was hand coded and all differences were resolved among coders. So this is a smaller, well, 4 teachers, small to medium data set. There was inductive coding using the communities of practice framework and deductive coding to explore what teachers brought to the interview. And so as part of the communities of practice framework, the identity framework, we looked at adoption of practices and ideologies, rejection, and also tension, something in between. And then regarding the phenomenon of the native speaker, we looked at the native speaker as a standard. So whether participants talked about this hierarchy of the native speaker as this idealized standard, whether they discussed non-native speakers, such as themselves, as less legitimate. And then we also discovered there was a lot of reflections on accents and discussions around accents. So this was a very iterative process. We developed the codes, did the coding, put it into ENA to look at the visualizations, went back to the qualitative data to make sense of the data and the story we were telling with those visualizations, went back to developing codes and coding. And this happened several times. And during this process, it helped us check our biases and our assumptions about the data. So for example, there were codes that we were really interested in at first and thought that they were going to be game changers. But after visualizing them, analyzing the meaning behind the links of the codes in a broader way, we realized they weren't as important and didn't bring clarity to the story we were telling. And so that's the first point right there, is a lot of these, the QE approach helps us directly confront our biases and assumptions in ourselves and our tools. So moving on to the results, the analysis, I'll share a little bit about that. We used a moving stanza window with 2 lines to capture what the interviewer was saying, as well as what the interviewee was saying, and to capture the recent temporal context. So we have an exploratory research question right now without a hypothesis. We're not looking at differences, so we're focused on the network visualizations and qualitative interpretations. So I'll share with you one excerpt from an interview with Alfonso, one of the teachers, that has aspects of tension and rejection specific to accents. He says, "I know that in a context in which I have learned English for teaching, I might have the idea that it would be important having a very good accent, or at least a standardized American English accent." So he's talking about, in the context for teaching, he kind of has the idea that a standardized accent is important. Then he goes on to say, but getting out of the teaching context, I think that having a strong accent, a Spanish accent, means that there has been a really good effort on learning a different language. And that is, of course, acceptable to me. There shouldn't be a judgment in this case. So what he's saying here is that in the context of teaching, he sort of has the idea that a standardized American English accent is important. But when he gets outside of the teaching context, he says there shouldn't be a judgment on people having a Spanish accent. And somebody trying to speak English with an accent is actually a really great effort that they're trying to learn the language. So there's kind of this duality here. And I'll show you the ENA network here, and I want to focus on this area right here related to this excerpt where Alfonso had the strongest connections, again, with reflections on accents, rejection, and tension. If we go back to that qualitative data again, the part that we see that is actually the rejection part is going against some of the ideologies in the teacher preparation program, that the native speaker or having a perfect English accent is important. Instead, he says that actually having a strong Spanish accent is acceptable to me. What's important to note is that he doesn't say this in terms of the teaching context. In terms of the teaching context, in his identity as an EFL teacher, he says, I might have the idea that it's important to have a standardized American English accent. And this is where the tension lies right here. Using this nuanced language of might have the idea. So he's not fully adopting the practices. He's still playing around with it. And there's other qualitative data to support the story that we're telling. But here's a way then to connect that directly to what his network says. So that's just one example of one participant. Using ENA, we were able to zoom in on one participant's discourse, as you saw, to see what the links between adoption, rejection, tension, and a native, non-native speaker lens looked like and interpret those links. But we were also able to zoom out to a middle level, where we grouped Alfonso with one other participant, Laura, on the left. If you remember, on the top, there was adoption. On the bottom, there was rejection and tension. That's how we're interpreting the space. On the left, if the centroid is on the left, teachers were connecting more with accents. If their centroid is more on the right, they were connecting more with the native as a standard, or making general statements about the native as a standard. So what we were able to do is see that Laura and Alfonso focused more on accents, although in different ways. One adopted more and the other one rejected more. And then Pablo and Vanessa, we grouped them as talking more about the native as a standard. So this was kind of this middle level. Then we zoomed out even more to build an average network of the 4 participants. So we have these different levels that we can use ENA in this case to look at. So here we see, although participants were mainly adopting the practices of their teacher program, they also experienced tensions on average across all 3 categories of practices. And these tensions also occurred with adoption or rejection. So it wasn't one or the other, and many times they were talking about these things at the same time. So these distinctions between and within groups reveal tension at personal, group, and aggregated levels that participants experienced, and allowed us to tell stories at multiple levels of how EFL teachers in training are grappling with their own personal expectations and those of their program. So this is the second point. In this case, it was ENA specifically. Using ENA, we could tell cohesive stories at multiple levels. Okay, so that analysis is kind of old news. I'm excited to share this new thing that we just started. Hazel just finished collecting data for another round of interviews, and I wanted to share a little sneak peek with you all because I'm excited about this new part, and it's related, it's similar to what Mike Phillips was talking about 2 webinars ago. So Hazel followed up with our participants to dig deeper into their identity development and ask questions specific to each participant based on our findings, and then she shared their ENA network with them. So in the protocol, she first presents them with a quote from their interview. So this is again the same quote, just as an example from that we saw earlier. And then she asked follow-up questions to unpack the quote. So follow-up questions like, if you've done interview research, the kind that you really wished you would have asked after you've read your data. And then after she did that, she generalizes the questions to the themes or the codes that we found in the data. So here she asked, in your first interview, you referred frequently to the contrast between the native and non-native speaker of English. What are the differences you perceive between the native and non-native speaker? Then after that, she introduces the network of the participants' network with a script. So she'll just say, let's look at a discourse network of your last interview, and goes through the network with them. And after she conducted the first interview, we met and we revised the script because we realized a few things that I'll share with you. So when she explained the nodes and the links and the weighted network, that part actually seemed to go really well. But what we realized is that we were using terms that we were very familiar with, but that teachers had not been exposed to, such as tension. And we didn't see this beforehand, but that's not a very friendly word, and it means a very specific thing in the Communities of Practice identity framework. But it can be off-putting when seeing it as a central theme in an analysis about yourself and your identity as a teacher. So we revised the script and explained carefully what we meant by that term. Next, we realized that we needed to set the stage to co-create meaning together with the teachers and to ensure that this network is just one interpretation of what they said. And so for the next iteration, we invited them to co-create meaning with us. So Hazel asked the teacher what their interpretation of the network was, whether it aligned with how they perceived it themselves, and if they would add or change anything. And here what you're seeing is she actually annotated the network with the teacher during the interview. So this is one example. It's kind of a more simple example. Some of them were more complicated, but you can see she's taking notes, and she did this as they were discussing the network. There's a dotted line here between reflection on accents and rejections, because that was what the teacher said, that she thought that she felt that there should have been a link between those two things for her discourse. So last, although we encourage them to co-create meaning with us, there's still a power dynamic between the researcher and the researched that still needs to be addressed and explored. So we break down those boundaries a bit by inviting our teachers to co-create understanding with us, but we still created the network and the codes without their input, and we still have more experience with the tools and the QE approach. And in this case, both Hazel and the teacher are looking at and closely examining the teacher's discourse and the teacher's network, and not Hazel's. So that puts a little bit of tension there, where the focus is on the teacher. So it's an interesting line of research for QE, involving our participants more deeply in the QE process and how that changes our roles and power dynamics and how it influences the meaning making of the data. So as I said, I think I watched the webinar with Mike Phillips, and it sounds like this is actually going to be an interesting line of research in the QE community. So that's the last point, researchers co-creating understandings with participants and collaborators. So these three things can be done with qualitative research methods, but what I'm saying is that QE allows us to dig deeper, do these things in better and in new ways through this power of computation and this iterative nature of QE. What this is going to result in, or that I've already seen, is that QE has the potential for telling these stories that have not been told before, and that's how powerful it is. It's essentially grounded, meaningful, database storytelling. And if we think about the affordances of this approach, such as the three that I pointed out, we can see how much more of a powerful method it is than just qualitative or just quantitative approaches alone. And it's clear to me why people from a variety of domains and perspectives are interested in and to use it to augment not only their own research, but to give a voice to and to involve those in research who have not been involved before, and specifically in ways in which they have agency in telling their own stories. So I think everyone from qualitative feminist researchers to quantitative data scientists, and I think especially feminist data scientists, can employ QE and reflect about its potential to be a rigorous and inclusive method. So if you want to hear or read more about some of the work that we're doing, you can go to the Idea Lab website or go to our Twitter account. I'm also happy to answer questions about the study. Hazel is here, she can answer questions about the study probably better than I can. I'm also happy to talk about some of the claims I'm making about QE, and even just broader about my professional and our professional trajectory with QE and ENA. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to throw it back to Simon.
Fantastic, Gol. Thank you for that. Let's have a round of applause. However you want to indicate that. Do you want to stop sharing, Gol, and then we can see everybody in the crowd? That was fantastic. I thought that was a very interesting discussion starter. I like the way that you gave us a little bit of insight into the process, especially for people who are new to ENA, understanding the process you went through, you know, looking at the codes, looking at the networks, trying to decide whether the links between the nodes actually made sense and represented what you meant them to represent, or whether they were talking back to you as well. That's different from just looking at codes on their own, you know, because we're now seeing the connections, and the visualization is talking back to the analyst as a work in progress, not as just, yeah. So that was very interesting to see. And then this idea of taking the network diagram back to the researched, the people who have been observed. We're seeing that in a bit of work now, and it's raising really interesting issues, I think. So let's throw it open to everybody. If you've got a question, then go to the participant panel and click on that More button, and you can stick your blue hand up, and I'll hand the mic and the camera to you. Or you can just type something in there. Okay, so we have Z's phone, Mystery Z. Why don't you ask your question?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. This is Zach. Sorry, my joined from my phone. Zach Swicki
I thought
from.
It might be.
Yeah, the mysterious Z. I went with one letter. Gol, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I had one question related to the process of describing the networks to the participants in the study, and I'm wondering, like, what you did to scaffold that process for them, and if it provided any insights into how we might adjust the visualizations for non-technical users.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to address it, and then I'm going to throw it to Hazel, if that's okay with you, Hazel, because she's the one who actually went through the protocol with the participants, so she can give you a more detailed answer to your question. But I'll tell you, when we developed the protocol, one thing I'll point out is that we're not looking at centroids. We're not explaining the mathematics, right? It's an interview, so we're just reflecting on the discourse. It's not being used then to make decisions or make moves in the moment. So it is kind of a simplified situation compared to potentially other research situations. So we wrote a protocol out, which I didn't share, but I mean, we'd be happy to share that with people if they're interested, that described the node link representation and the weights specifically. And then, as I said, Hazel first led with a quote. So in a sense, she led with the qualitative data. So the interviewer knew immediately, you know, went back to kind of, hopefully in their memory, what they were discussing, grounded that in what they said, and then we showed them the visualization. So I'm gonna throw it to Hazel. I'm gonna unmute her if that's okay, and maybe she can add. if I have the power to
Yeah.
unmute her.
Okay, just in time. I think the script was very, very important because it kept me focused, and it allowed me also to build in some space for questions that the students may have, and also a pause. And it also helped me to keep like on track with the language, again, to use like the words that would be more related to what they said. And also another thing that we did with the script is to personalize it to each participant. So I would use specific examples from each of the interviews. One difficulty that we had is that the very first interview was very far removed from the last one. We had 3 interviews. So that was like a year ago almost. So they didn't remember much of this. And that's why I messed up in the first interview, because I didn't have like enough quotes. But again, grounding in that quote, in that qualitative data first, because we discussed that for over 30 minutes. We really went deep into this quote, and I asked them a lot of questions. I have to say I have wonderful participants who jump on board with me and really reflect and think about these things. And if they don't have an answer, they say, I need more time, please ask me this later. So these are like sort of like special participants in that sense. But I try to create that sort of like a bridge from that first interview to the third one. And I think anybody who would be doing that would kind of have the same or a similar challenge, because there's a time between the first interview, data analysis, creation of the ENAs, and the second or the follow-up interviews. So there should be that creation, that scaffolding of going back really to what they said before. And that really helped for them to explain better what they wanted to say about the connections that they saw in the ENA. And it really takes time to build that traction. You know, it was relatively easy for them to understand the science behind the ENA, but it took a little bit of time to really click and say, oh, this is what it means for me, and have that aha moment for them. So you have to sort of like ask the right questions, and also give it some time, because they will get there. Most of them will get there, but they need a little bit more time to get to that deeper interpretation.
Right, Zach, did you want to come back on any of that? Okay, maybe not. I think that's very interesting. I think it made me think, okay, let's imagine QE in 5 years' time, or even sooner. What if we could end a session and then almost the next day, or even sooner, go back to the participants and say, play them the clip, play them the video of them doing something, show them the ENA diagram, you know, because the technology and the methodology has moved so fast. If we do that thought experiment, would that actually be good and helpful methodologically? Or is there actually value in not going back so fast? So just in terms of thinking about the research agenda for the field, you know, would we want to prioritize accelerating that closing of the loop process as fast as possible? Okay, I can see.
I had one, sorry, I had
Zach,
one other follow-up. I couldn't get it quickly enough with the system. But just quickly, I think it's really interesting the approach you guys took, is in a lot of our work, we've tried to show ENA representations or QE representations to I guess we could say non-native users of the tools, and we've prioritized on simplifying the visual representation. But it's you guys have taken another path in which you're starting with the qualitative interpretation and then going to the visual representation, at least first. And I think that's a kind of cool flip, and it might be something that we try in our systems later. After all, it is how we tend to write up our projects. We start with the qualitative often, and then go to the visualizations, but we haven't done that so much in real time. So.
Okay. I thought I saw somebody's hand go up. Mike. Yeah. Oh, your hand's gone down again. Mike, stick your hand up and I'll unmute you.
There we go. Got it. Gol, Hazel, thanks so much for sharing this. It's a really interesting and exciting development. And I've been doing a similar sort of thing and had the same question or nagging thought about the time difference between when you first talk with somebody and then you have the opportunity to show them a network map. And I also had the same challenge in terms of developing a shared language or a shared understanding of certain terms that are evident in the research literature. But in my case, I was working with in-service, not pre-service teachers. And they just don't talk in the same way that the research literature does. So what I ended up doing in an attempt to solve both of those challenges was I actually created a short video where I explained what the terms were. So when you see this is what we're talking about. And it then gave participants a chance to have a bit of a think about what those sorts of components might mean in terms of their own teaching practice. And that sort of gave me then a bit of time to create the network map before taking it back to them. So maybe in the short term, Simon, that's one way that we can bridge that temporal challenge, is to have some kind of intermediary step that still keeps participants connected with the research and allows us time to generate the representations. I don't know.
Yeah.
Could I pick up on that? I think that one of the things that I think both what Gol and Hazel have shared and what Mike was just saying related to Simon's point is in the temporal aspect of developing the networks and kind of doing the iterations refining, I think is in tension with that speed, because if you are doing an analysis for the first time, it might take you time to validate your coding, for instance, because if we're imagining that we have automated coding going, right? And on top of that, we might be developing new theories or something and need to engage with other folks and kind of feel that we have a fairly good grip on some phenomena, for instance. And so I could see kind of affordances of doing the real-time one. That was one of the first thoughts I had too, but also there could be we might have times where we need to have a delay and gap, right? And there could be even some benefits in terms of looking at someone's longer term trajectory of learning to look back if you're working with someone. I know some people are trying to look into using QE over much longer time periods. So I think this is a really interesting tension in and of itself to explore.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you mind if I jump in, Simon?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, one thing I mentioned very briefly was how will this change our roles with our participants? Can we make them research partners? So one way, Mike, as you're saying, have an intermediate step, why not involve them in some situations from the beginning to co-create that research with us? So why not involve them developing the codes, interpreting the data, even if it's their own data, if it's not their own data. I mean, these are interesting things that we can explore that then break down a little bit of the kind of roles that we have as researcher and non-researcher, right? Obviously, we have different levels of expertise. I'm not saying that we don't, that needs to be acknowledged, but what does that look like when they are involved from the beginning in the research process and helping us interpret those data or develop those codes?
Yeah. So work on participatory research and really empowering non-specialist scientists is going to be relevant here. David, throwing it to you, you had a comment which might be relevant here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so one thing I should just point out is, as probably a lot of you know, there actually is an entire field, sort of meta field of participant engaged research, where people have thought a lot more about these. I mean, maybe not more than you have, but certainly more than I have, about what it means to engage participants in the research process, regardless of what technique you're using. So I'd love to see a QE PER mashup, right? If we could come up with a better acronym, maybe. My question is actually sort of along those lines, although maybe a little less sophisticated than what Mike was saying. So like when you said, we use the word tension, and that meant something different and actually a little bit off-putting to the participants. Like, it's interesting because that's of course an edict term, right? And I'm wondering both, like, why choose an edict term and not an emic term for something like that, if it existed or invented or figured out or something, right? But also, there's another side to this. You said at one point you're talking about the teacher's network, not the researcher's network, and that creates a power dynamic. But the use of the edict terminology also creates a power dynamic. I mean, one of the nice things about forcing yourself to use edict terminology, at least when you're affiliating with participants, is you're actually playing on their field rather than the other way around. So it strikes me that this sort of that point is gonna get really interesting however one goes with this.
Gold, did you want to respond?
Sure, yeah, that's a great point. I think that it'll be interesting to explore what that looks like. So does that mean there's like a negotiation of terms then? Because you are bringing like a QE perspective, and there's QE language too. And, I'm just, it's a great like thought experiment and, well, down the line, real experiment of what that negotiation process looks like. I think this is very new, as I mentioned, for us. We just collected this data and just thought about doing this. So I think if we had thought about this ahead of time, we would think about bridging, that time and think more deeply about involving participants. But I think it's nice to hear what the community's thinking about this and sort of what some next steps are.
Yep. Okay. Peter Twining in Newcastle, Australia, throwing you the mic.
Yeah, I think I'll be giving the mic because I posted a comment in the chat asking about the extent to which people share their transcripts with participants anyway, and ask them to either confirm they're happy with them, redact bits of them, or add to them before you then get into the interpretation and further interpretation and analysis, and whether that might be another way to help bridge that gap between the time when you do the interview and you've done the analysis that you can share with them. I'm just interested in whether that's practice people already engage in.
Yeah, I mean, I can throw that to Hazel first, and then if other people also want to chime in on that. Hazel, did you go back to your participants at all in between that time period?
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I for some of them, I went back with them and I gave them a little bit of heads up that I had something to show to them that was created based on what they said in the first interview, and they were very interested. So my approach there was more of creating like an interest towards the ENA. So I said, I have something cool to show you, and we're going to talk about that in the last interview. So to create that sort of excitement, and have something brief to say about the edict terminology and probably what the next steps would look like in this project. Because actually, when I allowed participants to make modifications to the ENA and I annotated, they edited some of the terms. And I guess this is just my impression, they felt a little bit more comfortable in saying, so one of the participants said, okay, not tension, but maybe 50-50, because I feel that this is something that I'm not sure, and that's, that's part of the language that I used with them. This is not something that I'm not completely sure. So let's say it's 50-50, like I'm 50% sure and 50% unsure. And so that opportunity of giving them that space of editing some of the quotes that we had used as researchers. And I guess the annotation was a powerful tool into making them feel that they were empowered and taking like ownership of that tool.
Okay. And again, I expect there are things we can learn from the work David was referring to about how we engage participants more fully. Yeah, look, people say stuff, and then we analyze it to death, right? And when you come back to them, they might, well, what I really was getting at was, And we have to be careful that we're not reading, 25 million layers deep into some passing comment they might say. So being able to come back to them in a way that's structured and scaffolded could be extremely powerful. Okay, we've got a question from Daniel. I'm going to just read it out because he can't talk right now. Okay, what do you think the next step for the joint researched reflections are from the network diagrams? How do these practices change research and practice of the teachers? Who wants to take that? Next steps. Have you got plans for how you want to take that engagement further?
We're just talking about it now. I mean, we're excited to dive into the data first. We haven't actually done any of the analysis. Just wanted to share with you some of the data that we do have. So, we haven't really talked in detail about what the next steps are. Hazel is continuing this work by starting to design an intervention next. So that is a next step that's like related to this line of research, but not in terms of showing networks. So we haven't really talked about it, but there could be an opportunity then after the intervention to revisit some of these, the participatory design research point and working with her participants to look at these networks. And Hazel, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah. So this actually comes from the participants. When they looked at the networks, they said, well, this could change in a few years. Maybe the connections would change, or maybe the words would change completely. And they said, well, if I reflect more, if I think more about this, then chances are that this would not look the same. So they would looking at that as that flexible tool. So just thinking very much ahead, I would really like to do a more longitudinal study with them, because they haven't been, they're still pre-service teachers, although they have already graduated from their program. And due to the pandemic and everything, they're not in the classrooms. So they don't have their own classroom. So it would be very interesting to look at them in different points. So maybe more in their first 2 years, and maybe mid-career, and sometime also along the line. I would love to go back to them and see how, how they're thinking about these things, and how we are creating other networks, and what the networks look like for them. That being very, very interesting.
Okay, yeah, very helpful. I just had this image of, we can think of ENA as freeze framing, or as a mirror, right? If we freeze frame, we've just captured the moment in time, but no one ever gets to go back and say, well, there's more to that story than you've frozen, as opposed to more of a fluid mirror, or something which can be looked at and changed, etc. Okay. One thing that we'd like to do is sort of step back from this particular example, which is fascinating, and I wanted to really ask Gol to reflect a little bit, because she's been at Wisconsin-Madison, Northwestern, now she's at Clemson. Let's talk about, what does it mean to try and create a QE research lab? What kinds of culture or people and skill sets is needed to get this kind of thing going? Because that's the sort of thing we're now seeing, which is very exciting for the field. Have you got some reflections on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So starting with my postdoc at Northwestern, I was part of a research lab. A postdoc position is sort of an in-between position. You're not quite faculty, you're not quite a grad student. It's this weird middle ground. So you have some power, not a ton of power. But I'll have to say, at both places both at Clemson and at Northwestern, it's not that difficult. People are really interested in QE. The interest is really doesn't seem to be a problem. Once people find out about it, and ways that people found out about it was by reading my work, by me giving, brown bag talks, informal talks, by just making one-on-one connections with people approaching me. The interest is there. I think what's hard is the follow through. And part of that is because of the, just the how in depth the QE process is, how many different components it has, and the technical piece, especially from people coming from a qualitative lens. And then also the qualitative piece for people coming from a quantitative lens. And so being able to recognize who your audience is and what piece is interesting to them and what piece, you know, speaks to them, and using that as a jumping off point. At Northwestern, I have to be honest, it was mostly graduate students who were so interested. And so I'm still working with a few of them. And, you know, I think what's really important, whether whoever you're working with or what the role is finding kind of a core group, these early adopters. And once you find them, then they start to bring more people in. So for example, at Clemson, my early adopters are for sure my 2 graduate students, right? So Hazel, for example, you know, is bringing more graduate students in at Clemson who have been interested in what she's doing. So that just has been kind of spreading. Another thing is different avenues or venues. So one is at Clemson, we have a quantitative clinic. And I volunteered that we should have, you know, I can be the QE expert at the quantitative clinic. So that's just another way to get QE out there and build that community. I'm also going to develop and teach a QE course, graduate course at Clemson starting very soon. So that's another avenue to do that. And then again, I think just finding people who either have, you know, a strong qualitative or quantitative perspective, and then building on what their strengths are and easing them into the other side of it, I think.
Yeah, and is it easy to find people with the skill set? I mean, people don't walk into labs with strong quant and qual very, very often, right? So it's going to be a team. Right. It's going to be a team sport.
Yeah, I think part of it then is developing that other side for people. Again, if the interest is there, or if they're part of my lab and they kind of have to do it. I'm joking, half joking. But, you know, being able to develop that skill set. So there's lots of ways to do that. I can give you just one concrete example. We just had a lab meeting where, you know, Hazel and Cinnamon coded all this data. And then I gave them kind of a live think aloud of what I would do if I put that data into ENA, and went step by step, unrehearsed, you know, of what my thinking process would be like. So that's an example specific, I think, to mentoring and to graduate student mentoring of what that process could look like. And, you know, them being able to answer questions or ask questions, me answering them, and us, again, that word co-constructing the meaning together as we analyze the ENA networks.
Sharing practices like that could be extremely helpful as people start to want to move into this space. Yeah, Brendan.
Yeah, I was just going to add real quick, and then I think I see Andrew's got a hand up. But one of the things that I really liked about both what Gol said and what Simon mentioned as it being a team sport is that in my experience, when you're trying to kind of cultivate QE culture, you make an assessment of where people's skills are. So that's relating to what Gol is, if they have some background or they lean one or the other. And then not only developing their skills, but getting them to trust other people and value someone else that maybe could be part of the team that could bring that skill set in. And then they can learn as they go forward. You don't necessarily have to swallow all of QE at once. And that's really where we've seen, I mean, in the COVID-19 data challenge was really good, where you have people that have different complementary skill sets that then can come together, kind of Voltron style, but actually then achieve some of these more complex things. Ultimately, I think, though, it's a great goal to have in both of the language to make that kind of unified language. So I like those points, and I've seen that work for a number of different research groups around the world, actually. Do we want to try
to add?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to add to that for a second. Like, I also think that that's why this community is so important, because Gol has been very fortunate in that she came out of, she was at Wisconsin at a place where there was lots of people talking about QE, and now that she's going to new places, she carries enough of that culture with her that she doesn't, she's not grasping at straws. But there are lots of people, even some people on this call, right, who are the only person where they are who are doing what they're doing. Or worse, they're a graduate student who wants to do this, and none of their professors know anything about it. And so the fact that this community exists is a real opportunity for people to leverage that, and especially in the kind of these earlier days, I think that's going to be critical. And what I've seen so far is the community is very open to that. But I think it's hard for people to make that ask sometimes. And I hope that the people who have made the ask feel like they're getting a response that warrants kind of further asking.
Right. Well, the joy of the internet may make it possible for these kinds of conversations to happen, even though we can't all be at Wisconsin-Madison or Clemson. Andrew's got his hand up. Go, Andrew.
Thanks, Simon. Sorry, I put my hand up a while back, and the conversation has sort of moved on
Oh,
since
sorry,
then.
I missed that.
So no, it's totally fine. So this may not be as relevant, and it may be a little bit big of a question to tackle in 1 minute. But Gol, this approach that you guys are starting to develop is I think super fascinating, and it's making me rethink a whole bunch of stuff about sort of the way that we might do kind of ethnographic research in in an ISQE framework. But one of the things that it also makes me wonder is, what have you guys run across any cases where like the sort of the kind of co-construction or approach to kind of finding that compromise position actually is compromising in some ways, right? Where like from a research perspective, you actually see something very clearly that a participant would maybe fight back against, right? I mean, in the extreme case, imagine you have a participant who's like a Trump or somebody, right? Who you're just not going to be able to work with in that way, or who's just not going to accept that, things that they say have particular meanings or, that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you've speaking, since so much of this revolved around tension, I'm wondering if you ever encountered tensions between the two perspectives where they weren't very easy to reconcile, or where as a researcher, you or maybe Hazel or another member of the team felt very strongly for a particular interpretation that didn't jibe well with what the participant really wanted, the research to show about them, or something analogous to that.
Yeah, I'll just say really briefly, and then I'll throw it to Hazel to talk specifically about the study, but I'll say briefly about participatory research. That's part of the findings, right? A lot of times when you're talking about that participatory research. So, it's not something to be like feared or I think anticipated. It's part of that process that can then inform future participatory research processes. So just collecting that data, recognizing that tension, and then analyzing, what's happening when that negotiation is tense or comes to a halt, or there's just no compromise. I mean, that's part of that process that we need to analyze and rethink and include as part of the research. But Hazel, do you want to talk? I know we're running out of time. If we have time, about specifically the 4.
Yeah. So not yet. I haven't encountered like that. Can you listen to me? Okay. So I haven't had that challenge yet, although I opened the floor and I said, you can agree with this or completely disagree with this. We want to listen to your interpretation of this network. There are no right or wrong answers here. I want to listen to what is the meaning that you give to this, or if this doesn't make any sense at all. So probably like that use of that language. And again, that use of that language allowed them to feel owners of these networks in a sense. And so that helped a little bit. And when they disagreed, I just made the changes. So I just made a thicker line, or made a line where it doesn't, it was not there. And I just made sure that any modification was and was grounded in the data. Actually, what they were saying to be added, they would just elaborate, and we would go back to the qualitative data. So again, to that loop, we would go back to that one. And again, I think like the reconciliation can be found in the qualitative data, in the meanings that they're given. That maybe they're not agreeing with certain things, but the meaning of what they're saying, they're actually agreeing. And again, we haven't really analyzed this. It's just what my impressions are of the last interviews that I had with them. But for the most part, with those participants, they agreed with that. And when they didn't agree with something, they would just modify it. And they said, well, add this or take away this, or I don't feel like that's the way it is.
Right. It certainly complicates the process, but it could actually give it greater integrity. And I'm seeing, you know, I'm seeing a whole workshop here at the conference to try and unpack some of these really fascinating questions. Okay, so look, folks, we should probably wrap up. It seems to me like we could all do this for a lot longer.
Can I throw one thing out real quick, Simon, before we
yes.
Just real quick, Rogers was talking about, you know, him kind of fighting the good fight by himself at the University of Oslo. We're working on, the society is working on hopefully launching tools soon, kind of like the Slack channel used during the COVID-19 data challenge, so that we can have ways to connect with other people. So look for that coming hopefully soon, but know that we're trying to build that to beyond just these webinars, have tools and spaces to let people link up. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you for sharing that, because it sounds like we need better collaboration infrastructure around this. Okay, let's thank Gol and Hazel for their contributions one final time. That was fantastic. Very generative discussions. So come back and join us on the 3rd of September, the 4th if you're down under. Same time. We've got Srećko Joksimović from University of South Australia talking about where social and epistemic networks meet. Okay, thank you again, everybody, and stay well.